Welcome to Encouraging Wellness, where we shed light on the plethora of holistic healing and wellness methods so you can give yourself the power to ask why and become bigger than the condition you are dealing with or the illness you are currently fighting. Join Pamela Worth as she sits down with doctors, medical experts, healthcare practitioners, and those with unique healing stories to dissect groundbreaking practices that combine traditional Western medicine with alternative modalities. Hear conversations that empower you to go beyond hurtful stigmas, outdated practices, and unnecessary labels, guiding you towards a healthier and happier you. Here, we highlight your true worth and help unleash your inner courage. Now your host, Pamela.
Hi, this is Pamela from Hello Health and the Encouraging Wellness podcast. I'm so happy to have Dr. Jacoby here with us today. Hi, Dr. Jacoby.
Good morning. How are you? I'm sorry about the gray day here in Scottsdale. It's not normal for July. Amazing.
It's not normal at all, but that's okay. It's nice to have some rain. So tell us a little bit about you and your practice and how you got in. And obviously, you're a published author and touch on some of the work that you've done there as well.
Well, it really goes back 50 years when I was first in Philadelphia working in Ben Franklin Clinic, which is a research center in Philadelphia. I was a student at the time and I was working in the biochemistry lab. We were working on PKU, which is a birth defect, supposedly of genetic origin. But I think now looking back, it's really environmental epigenetic problem, very much like autism is today. So I got the bug on biochemistry back then. And when I came back to Phoenix a long time ago and met your father, as a matter of fact, which is very unusual that happened, but that was a good thing. And I trained as a standard podiatric medical student in Philadelphia at the time and did elective surgery for the most part. And about 30 years ago, I helped Honor Health here in Scottsdale start their wound care center. We did a lot of diabetic neuropathy patients. At that time, there's a lot of amputations for that disease. And I had the fortune to run into Dr. Lee Dellon, who's a professor of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins about 20 some years ago. And he had a novel approach to that diabetic neuropathy problem, which is really decompression of nerves, very much like the upper extremity for carpal tunnel. And he applied that theory to the lower extremity. I heard his lecture. We became good friends. I trained with him down at Johns Hopkins about 20 years ago on his methods, brought it back to Scottsdale. And I did lots and lots of those surgeries. They work, they prevent amputations. One day I said to Dr. Dellon, I said, there's got to be more to your theory. And he said, why don't you figure it out? Well, his theory is still not mainstream. This is now 40 years later after he discovered this. And is, I think, a very simple concept. I think it applies to autism and autism spectrum disorder. And even using that term of autism, which to me is a descriptive term of inflammation of a particular nerve. And that nerve to me is the hypoglossal nerve. And here's how I got to this theory. Dr. Dellon, and there's an amazing amount of research on this. It's not like somebody wrote a paper. There's thousands and thousands of papers written on the biochemistry of nerves. So let me just walk your audience through this carefully and slowly. So number one, the polyol pathway. What does that mean? That means when sugar essentially gets inside the nerve, whether it's high fructose corn syrup, the fructose or glucose, overloads the nerve will turn into sorbitol. Sorbitol is an alcohol sugar, and it pulls water into the nerve. It swells the nerve so that the conduction, the electrical impulses going through that particular nerve are not going to conduct as they should. That's number one. Number two is the Maillard reaction. I think this is probably the most fundamental biochemical reaction. And really that is a cooking term. So it's a French word meaning a sugar plus a protein equals a reaction, which is called the Maillard reaction. What it essentially does is takes the soft tissue, the collagen, around the nerve and inside the nerve and contracts it. And it also contracts the tunnel through which the nerve is running through. So we have two biochemical pathways, one where the nerve is getting bigger and the tunnel is getting smaller. To me and to Dr. Dellon, that means compression. That's the fundamental basis for diabetic polyneuropathy. I said to him, I think there's more to it. He said, figure it out. I got lucky. I found a good article in Circulation written by Dr. John Cook. And if you want to look that up, his name is spelled with an E. John is a PhD in the biology and chemistry of nerves, and he also is a world famous cardiologist by training. He was running the Diabetic Institute at Stanford and molecular biology. And I read his article in 2004, roughly. And I called or I texted him. I said, Dr. Cook, I think your theory may have something to do with Dr. Dellon's theory. He called me on the phone 2 hours later, said, come up to Stanford, which I did. And I worked with him on this concept that his molecule, now this is where it gets a little confusing. The word is asymmetric dimethyl arginine. That's the molecule. And what does that word mean? Well, asymmetric means the two methyl groups are not on either side of the arginine molecule. They're on one side. That seems like a trivial change, but it's a very important change in my mind, as well as Dr. Cook's theory as well. So what does it do? It blocks the nitric oxide pathway. Now, when Dr. Dellon at Johns Hopkins was writing all his papers, he was obviously using what was known in the literature at that time. The Nobel Prize for nitric oxide wasn't discovered until 1997. And I was looking at this, and Dr. Cook was looking at this early 2000. When you put the two theories together, you can see that this is a biochemical reaction of sugar as it affects nerves. Now, you're probably asking, your audience is asking, what's it got to do with autism? I mean, what is autism? Now, this is my understanding of autism, spectrum disorder, no matter what we want to call it. And I just want to walk through the nomenclature of medicine over the last 400 or 500 years. When doctors looked at different symptoms, they gave it a name, like Alzheimer's, MS, multiple sclerosis. All these are descriptive terms of inflammation of nerves. Mm-hmm. If you go back to 1860s, where a lot of this work was done, especially in France, by Dr. Charcot. Charcot, in my field, diabetic neuropathy, Charcot foot, Charcot-Marie tooth disease. What were they really describing? Inflammation. And where was it coming from? Because the human genome never saw sugar in these levels ever before. And so I'm going to switch a little bit over to anthropology. Now, I know this sounds like a big lecture, but this is a big problem, and it's not being solved. Human beings did not eat sugar, period. They ate meat. They're carnivores. Now, I know there's a big debate, and even today, herbivores, carnivores, salad eating, meat eating. It's what we ate as human beings is meat. Now, we like other things. We like to eat wheat and corn and carbohydrates. And that's the problem. Because once we became domesticated about 10,000 years ago, let's talk about Egypt in terms of what did they do? Well, it's very interesting. The Egyptians 10,000 years ago were a bread-based society of wheat. They ate 4 pounds of bread a day. And when you look at the mummification, which I was surprised when I went through all these papers, they mummified just about everybody. For what reason, I don't know. But when you look at the bodies, you'll see cardiovascular disease. And the cardiovascular disease is not caused by fat. It's caused by sugar. And this is the fundamental point that I think we can make the connection with autistic spectrum disorders. If a society is eating a lot of wheat, which is basically sugar, carbohydrates, then you'll get inflammation. But our human diet is meat. That's what we thrive on. So is the United States a carbohydrate-driven society or a meat-driven society? And the answer is it's sugar. Mm-hmm. So let's go back about 20 years ago. There's a good paper in Scientific America on autism spectrum disorder. It's written by embryologists. Now, embryologists are basically PhDs in basic science. They've written some really good papers on this issue, and they talked about the hypoglossal nerve. But they were looking at thalidomide, which is another genetic problem from a chemical. But they noticed autistic kids had, at autopsy, had a difference in their hypoglossal nerve origin, which is at the base of the brain, which has a structure called the olive. And that's at the base of the brain. So on day 20 to day 24, roughly in that area, when the neural tube is developing, there's a lack of a protein placed at that time when the neural tube is forming. So, and that, I don't know if you can see that there. So 1.1 millimeter difference at the base of the brain where the hypoglossal nerve is forming, the neuron, mm-hmm. on autistic kids. There's a glitch in the, literally, if I'm using a metaphor properly, if you're thinking of the neural tube is being printed day by day. And if there's a glitch on that, the spectrum around the brain, the eyes, the ears, and internally where the hypoglossal nerve is formed, that space is 1.1 millimeter less in autistic spectrum kids versus normal. To me, that is compression, because the nerve is in between the space. And if it's like that, it can't function. That particular nerve innervates the tongue. Hypo means under, glossal means tongue. The tongue is the main articulating organism for speech, and that's delayed. And that's the number one symptom of autistic spectrum kids. Now, that describes the mechanism, but what I did was took Dr. Dellen's theory of nerve compression and coupled with Dr. Cook's theory of the biochemistry of the nervous system, and especially of the autonomic nervous system, which is the first biochemical problem that develops. So let's go back to my area of expertise, which is the leg, diabetic neuropathy. And if you have nerves that are swelling at the same time the tunnel that they go through is contracting, you're going to get compression. Mm-hmm. And distal, meaning whatever is supplied by that particular neurovascular bundle, which is a nerve, going to a muscle that performs a function. In my field, it's walking. So if the muscle is not working, then that function doesn't happen. So you get numbness, tingling, burning, and you eventually cannot walk. You have no feeling. And in my field, you do an amputation. And that's what usually happens if you don't do a decompression surgery. So take that whole concept and apply it to all the different itises, as I like to call them, throughout the body. And in this particular one, it's a nerve preconception, and we'll have to talk about that separately, but where it came from and why it's happening. But that nerve is getting compressed. So I went through all the different peripheral nerves and cranial nerves, which hypoglossal nerve is a cranial nerve. It's slightly different than a peripheral nerve, but still essentially the same. It performs a function, and it operates a muscle. And that's what a hypoglossal nerve is, purely a motor nerve. It operates a muscle. So any mechanism that interrupts that is going to cause a autistic spectrum disorder symptom. Mm-hmm. So I know that's a lot of information, and let me ask you the question, because your audience, I assume, is more traditional thought pattern on this disease pattern. Is that correct?
Folks listening tend to have open views on different ways of thinking about this. And I think one of the follow-up questions would probably be, okay, so if it's a compressed nerve, is it possible to uncompress it? Is there anything that can be done after the fact to relieve some of these symptoms?
And the answer is yes. So presently I'm writing a new book, and if I can stay on track and get this done, I'll get it done. But right now it's being called Unglued. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm calling it that is, and I'll go back to the fundamental problem, back to the diet, glucose. The word glucose, and I did not know this until a couple months ago. It's just amazing. I was asked by a think tank group for my first book, Sugar Crush, well, what's causing this? I said sugar. And they said specifically, which one? And I think it's really more high fructose corn syrup than it is glucose. But somebody asked me, he said, well, what's the word mean? And I said, you mean, where did it come from? I did not know. I had to look it up. And I'm going to ask your audience. This is so fundamental to this problem. Glucose, 2 syllables. The first word is glue. That's exactly what it is. Glue. It's adhesive. It's sticky. And when glucose is high in our metabolic system, it gums. I use that metaphor. It gums up the works. Mm-hmm. And one of which is this nerve, the hypoglossal nerve, which is kind of shocking when you think about it. The human body only can use 1 teaspoon of glucose at any one time. Anything above that is toxic. Mm-hmm. So, is the American diet toxic? Anybody thinks it's not is not thinking this through. It's toxic. Which toxin? It's sugar. So how does that sugar actually cause that problem? Well, then we get into genetics, and we get into the concept of epigenetics. So I don't know if your audience is well versed in that part of this, and I can do a deep dive because I think that's the answer.
Well, is there a way to detox your body out of being unglued? And maybe that's what you're going to go to in your new book. So.
Yes, and unglued, and that's a big problem, not only for autistic spectrum, but for every inflammatory condition. So let's get on a plane and go with me to Panama for a second. Okay. So this is about 3-4 years ago, and I've been there a couple of times now. Dr. Reardon's clinic in Panama is a stem cell clinic. Stem cells do work for autistic spectrum disorder. I was there personally. I've seen them. And how does it work and why does it work? Well, autistic kids love sugar. Mm-hmm. And I was there in Panama. Panama, by the way, is a very beautiful modern city. And I was in his clinic, which is on the 74th floor of the Hilton Tower. And in the cafeteria where everybody was eating, now, of course, I'm thinking about these conditions differently than most people. Now, Dr. Reardon's a PhD, got a beautiful clinic. He treats with stem cells. So I have to tell you what stem cells are, why they work, and how they work. So he is using umbilical cord tissue, which has stem cell qualities in it. And he grows them in his laboratory from millions of cells into billions of cells, and then injects that intravenously into these kids. Now, he was treating lots of other things besides autism. Multiple sclerosis was a very common problem down there. Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a little segue. Why would it work on anything? And I'm going to tell you what I think is the answer. And I use this term. Stem cells don't give a rat's ass what you call your itis. That's fundamental to what I'm saying. Multiple sclerosis is another inflammatory neurodegenerative nerve issue.
Right.
It's the 10th cranial nerve. Autism is the 12th cranial nerve. They're almost neighbors. They're getting inflamed. So this is where the epigenetics comes in. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think the similarity between what stem cells do. They don't care what you call your nerve itis. They don't speak English. They just know inflammation in a biochemical and physiologic basis. So there I am in Panama, and I'm seeing MS people get the infusions. They get better. Their gait is improved because the number one symptom with MS is they are in wheelchairs because they can't walk because of just what I told you in the first place. Right. It's a nerve compression. Okay, now the autistic kids, and there were a lot of them there, and they were from every country on the planet, from Africa, South America, Canada, obviously a lot of Americans, but they all look the same because their faces are the same because of that day 22 protein that's not placed, and then you get the compression. But the eyes are slightly different. The ears are slightly different. Doesn't matter what race they are. I'm sitting there observing all these kids, and one particular kid, and she actually was from Canada. She lived in Mexico, mm-hmm. and her child was about 14 years of age. And I said to her, "Is this your first time at the clinic?" And she said, "No, this is my third time." I said, "Really? Well, tell me about your experience." She says, "Well, we spend a week and the symptoms go away after he gets his infusions." I said, "Well, how long does it last?" And she said, "Well, about a year." And I said, "Well, tell me more about it." He said, "Well, he's unable to speak. And when he gets the infusions, he starts to speak." Mm-hmm. I said to her, "What did he say?" And he said, "I want a donut." He wants sugar.
Yeah.
I watched all these kids. They all eat the same. Not to be derogatory, they look like they're dogs eating because they don't want anybody to take the sugar away from their eating. And she was doing the same thing. The kids were eating muffins and orange juice and pancakes and all that kind of crap. And I said, "Well, in my theory, that's what's causing the problem." She got very upset with me because she said, "I'm going to bring him here. I want my kid to have everything that he can have." And I said, "Well, then why you give him sugar?" Well, that ended the conversation. She obviously had a lot of money because that was the third time. It cost about $20,000 per treatment.
Wow.
Does it work? Yes, it does. Does it work in the United States? Yes, if you can get it. Now, here's the problem with all this stem cell discussion. The FDA, our friendly people at the Federal Food and Drug Association, don't allow us to do what we need to do with these tissues. Now, you can do it in the United States, but you kind of have to be careful. So they've called it 351. That means I can use this stuff, but I can't tell you it works. Actually, I can advertise it, and I can tell you nothing about it because it's a 351. Now, if I want it to be a 361, which means it's a drug, then I have to go into an institutional review board study for a new drug application. And well, that cost about $1 billion and takes about 10 years through the FDA. Well, I don't have that money, and I assume you guys don't either. But the FDA does when they go out to the industry. Now, I'm sure Mr. Pfizer said, I'll do that because he will then own what's called a Q code to charge the insurance companies, and he will make billions. Does it work? You bet you it works. The question is, who's going to own it? So right now, you can't really get everything you need to get in the United States, although there are places that kind of go skirt the quote law. Mm-hmm. Dr. Reardon in Panama is doing it works. Okay. Now, do they have double-blind studies? No, of course not. Who wants to be in a double-blind study? It's ludicrous. Yeah. It's safe. It's effective. Buyer beware. Traditional medicine does not work on any of these diseases. They don't. They may, as I say, psychobabble this problem, speech therapy, not to be derogatory to that. They're doing the best they can, but it does not reverse the inflammatory problem. So, unglued, what's the number one thing you need to do? Don't eat sugar, period. Well, that's not healthy. Yes, it is, in my opinion. I hear this every day. Now, I'm going to the hospital about an hour to do nerve decompressions on diabetic people. And they'll get better. And will they change their diet? Well, they'll give it lip service because these people are addicted to sugar, as everybody is. And I can get into all the reasons of addiction, and we can talk about the epigenome and why we have this problem in the United States, because this is a sugar-based society. And the sugar is coming from high fructose corn syrup, in my opinion, and it's corn. And how is corn made? And it's made with genetically modified seed from Monsanto, and that active ingredient is glyphosate. Stephanie Seneff, I don't know if you know her. She wrote a book. Everybody in your group should read it. Toxic Legacy, which she goes into detail of how that molecule, which is glyphosate, which is the amino acid glycine, which is interesting because that's the sticky molecule. That's where the word comes from, GL, glue. And that's what happens. It's just this very, very tiny change in our genome. That high fructose corn syrup gets into the gut through our food, and it alters the gut bacteria, which is called this, and through a chemistry called the shikimate pathway. And that molecule causes leaky gut. All these things are true. Leaky gut, but it influences the vagus nerve. It goes up to the brain, to the hippocampus, and that's where the addiction comes from. And it permeates an entire organism. So, unglued, stop eating it. Actually, unglued should say eliminate glyphosate from our genome because it cannot handle it. Now, that's not going to happen because we're not going to have any corn crop anymore, or soy, because just about everything in the United States is genetically modified. So it's a huge problem. Back to in year 2000, when that article was written in Scientific American, by the way, you should look it up. I think it was around February 2000 or 2001. The number of autistic spectrum problems were 16 per 10,000 at that time. And the most recent data that I could find, it's 1 in 40 roughly. Well, it's a better diagnosis? Nonsense. It's the genome that's being changed by high fructose corn syrup, which was introduced into the American diet in 1974. So let's just use some simple math. A woman's going to have her first child, let's say at age 20, just for simple math, 74 to 94, and you look at the chart, that's when it started to go up. And now it's out of control.
Yeah.
Absolutely out of control. Looking for a drug, by the way, that's what all the universities are looking for. How do I monetize this problem? They're not going to put billions of dollars into research to find a reason for the problem. They want to have a drug to treat the problem. It's that simple. And if you go to I've been to every university preaching this. Do you think I get a grant? No. Where's the return on the investment?
Yeah.
Well, I'm telling you what's causing it. Well, we don't want to hear that. So there's my tirade.
Thank you, Dr. Jacoby. And I appreciate I don't want to say scientific, but it's also a scientific explanation into how and why we're seeing a lot of this. And so certainly in our own family, eliminating sugar has been incredibly difficult, but incredibly impactful on our overall health. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. In summary, removing sugar, improving your diet through eating more lean meats. Obviously, there's certain other things that can certainly be helpful to folks that feel very strongly about being plant-based. And then, obviously managing inflammation through a variety of different ways, then, I think we can experience much greater health.
Even that term you just used, you said lean meat. And that's embedded in our vocabulary as if that is healthy. That is not healthy. Fatty meat is what you want. Actually, if you didn't even eat the meat, you'd be fine.
Yeah.
The fat is what we need, omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah.
So I didn't touch on supplements. Supplements are very important, obviously. So omega-3 fatty acid, cod liver oil, that's probably the best, because we don't have omega-3 in our diet. When we're eating a high carbohydrate diet, the American diet is probably about 20 to 1 ratio of omega-6 over 3s. So if you go back 10,000 years ago, not Egypt, other just primitive societies, the ratio was 1 to 1. Mm-hmm. And omega-3s are anti-inflammatory and 6s are pro-inflammatory. That was the balance. So our diet, from any sources that you're getting omega-6, and then you get into the seed oils, we're not eating the right fat. We're eating corn-fed meat, which is high in omega-6. So just saying eat meat really is not the answer.
So that's going back to the grass-fed meats that you're...
Grass-fed and everything. Okay. Exactly. But the pushback I get from my patients and other doctors is, you don't understand, Dr. Jacoby, you're a podiatrist. I said, that's exactly why I understand. I know the biochemistry. I know all that sort of thing, but I have a different viewpoint because I'm doing amputations all day long, or used to. I don't do them anymore. Yeah. I fix them. And I tell the patients, it's your diet. It's not a inevitable problem. It's back to the genetic, epigenetic concept. You carry the genes as a potential. If you don't come into contact with the trigger, which is sugar, and glyphosate, I think is very big in this, then you won't trigger the disease. Now, unfortunately, with the autism spectrum disorder, that is a genetic change preconception. Mm. And those kids had no causal connection to this. This was given to them. Alzheimer's, which is the adult form of autism, which is another nerve, the olfactory nerve, is acquired over time by our behavior. So we cause our own problems. Now, by the time you hit 80 and you have it, it's a bad disease, but at least you had a good life. These kids have a horrible life, and the public really doesn't understand what's going on. And they're letting these companies poison our diet. It's that simple. And the FDA, which is an interesting word, the Food and Drug Administration, they're doing nothing about the food. Yet, when it comes to stem cells, they have all kinds of protection in place to not let you get this. It's a naturally occurring substance, and they want to make it into a drug.
Yeah.
Why would they want to make it into a drug? Because that's where the money is. If it's safe and effective, why would they care?
Yeah.
They only care because it's a tremendous amount of money, because it's going to destroy the healthcare system, because you don't need all of those other drugs.
Yeah.
And they would be destroyed.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jacoby. So tell us, what is the name of your first book so that people can find more information? And then when is your second book coming out?
Well, the first book, Sugar Crush, it was published in 2015, HarperCollins. Okay. It's out in paperback now. It's also in audio. My new book, Unglued, is at the editors as we speak, but that's a long process, hopefully before the end of the year.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Is there, and do you have a website or something people should visit you at if they'd like to contact you for more information?
I have a couple of different websites. Extremity Health Center is probably number one. The book has Sugar Crush, the book.
Good.
So there's lots of these articles in that for reference.
Super. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
That's it for this episode of Encouraging Wellness. We hope this serves as an eye-opener to you on new ways to approach your health and wellness. By learning both unique and the best alternative wellness and healing methods, you can live your best life. Listen to more of our episodes at www.hello.health. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a rating. Together, let us work towards unlocking you and your family's best self. Thank you for listening. See you on the next one.